Hi, and welcome to part four, the classical period. Just as a forewarning, this period in our study of the music in it tends to be some of the most difficult study you'll do this semester because we get into some fairly complicated music. So get on board and be ready for quite a ride. Classical period was not of long duration, from about 1750 to about 1820. This was the age of enlightenment, where people began to believe that the power of reason was far more important than the power of authority. And they began to question the authority of traditional leaders like the nobility and kings, the church, and so on. There was a great belief in progress, and the middle class was beginning to feel its oats, demanding its rights, and actually questioning the privileges of the noble class. There were rulers who were kind of enlightened in this period of time who voluntarily abolished serfdom, created more equal laws, and basically tried to pull things back from the ostentatious display of the era preceding, where monarchs were seen to be absolute in authority. There was the Age of Revolution, wars in America and France in particular, and an average person, Napoleon, raised to the status of emperor, not because of his birthright, but because of his abilities. There was a preference in the arts for lighter and more intimate art, not quite so much for the heavy displays and the ornate kind of art that had come before in the Baroque period. There was a gradually more and more of a preference for simpler forms, for clarity and balance, the kinds of values that we saw in the ancient Greeks and Romans and that we saw in the very early part of the Baroque period. These became preferences again. There were ethical considerations for the first time. Excessive ornamentation was really associated with the older aristocracy and was really avoided. And there was, of course, an enormous amount of change in who patronized the arts, who supported the arts. In music, the classical style we kind of got a little preview of in the music of Vivaldi and Handel, the lighter, sometimes homophonic textures that they used. The classical period, unlike any other period we're going to study, really was centered in Vienna, in one city, and dominated by three composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. In no other period of Western music has the entire era been so dominated in one place and by so few people. There were many other composers at that time, but the three great giants were those three, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. And for the first time, instrumental music really takes off and exceeds vocal music in terms of innovation, interest, popularity. And opera also grew quite a bit in complexity and popularity. The classical orchestra was the great performing medium of this period. In the Baroque, there were orchestras, and we heard some examples of orchestral playing. There might have been maybe 20, 25 players at the most in a Baroque orchestra. Mostly string players, maybe one or two oboes, maybe a couple of flutes. Once in a while, the addition of, say, a trumpet or timpani, but that was pretty much it. Whereas the classical orchestra really became much larger, maybe up to 15 or even 60 players. Violins, first and second violins, violas, cellos, and double basses, of course, were part of the classical orchestra. The woodwinds really grew in number and type. There were always a couple of flutes, a pair of flutes, pair of oboes, pair of clarinets, a new instrument, and a pair of bassoons. In the brass, there were always two horns and two trumpets. And the addition of the horns was something quite new in the classical period. And in the percussion, usually two timpani. The technical evolution of instruments had begun well before the beginning of the classical period. By about 1700, 1710, there were a lot of instrument makers who were experimenting with better ways to create instruments. The Baroque instruments that we've heard were typically unvalved, kind of natural instruments, and they were very difficult to play well because there was no way to control them except through a very sophisticated use of one's own embouchure and the way one would do the fingering. So during the classical period, there was an increasing speed of change in the construction of woodwind and brass instruments. The clarinet, as I said, was a new instrument, And really important, which we'll find out more about in the 19th century, the invention of the pianoforte and how popular it became with families. This really displaced the harpsichord at a certain point, and by the end of the classical period, the harpsichord was really thought of as an instrument that was very old-fashioned and not really used too much anymore. Form was the greatest innovation of the classical period. The multi-movement instrumental work, be it for a solo instrument or a set of 3 or 4 string players or a symphony for a large orchestra, the multi-movement instrumental work was really the powerhouse type form in the classical period, often 4 movements. This is in your textbook and you can read it. The first movement was generally in sonata form, a form that we'll study in depth. The second movement was slower, maybe lyrical, simpler form, theme and variations, or a binary or ternary form. The third movement was almost always a dance-related form, usually in triple meter. And then the fourth movement, the final movement, was fast, could be in sonata form or possibly in rondo form. Sonata form is the biggest innovation of the classical period in terms of form, the most significant formal structure, and one that is really still active today in composers' minds. It's made up of 4 major sections: the exposition, which contains first and second themes, the development section, where all kinds of dissonance and development and change of those theme materials can happen, very unstable, different keys explored. The recapitulation, where the first theme comes back in its original key, and the second theme, which had been presented originally in its own key, comes back and is kind of resolved into the key of the first theme, sort of coming back to home base or tonic. And then sometimes a coda. In the later works of the classical period, codas were much more popular, particularly with Beethoven. You'll be listening to examples of sonata form in this part of the course. A fairly straightforward example of it in Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, the first movement, just to get your teeth kind of cutting on this whole concept. And then a much more complex and really astounding example of sonata form, the first movement of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. And strap yourself in when you listen to that one. It's been one of the favorites of students, and it's really an exciting piece. You'll love it. Other classical forms we'll study. We're going to look at theme and variations. That'll be the second movement of Haydn's Symphony No. 94 in G major, called the Surprise Symphony. And you'll hear in this movement why it's called the Surprise Symphony, what the surprise is. Minuet Trio is one of the most popular dance-style movements, and we'll hear a very simple example of that in the Serenade, Eine kleine Nachtmusik by Mozart, the third movement. And then we're going to take a little look at a rondo form from an early string quartet by Beethoven. The fourth movement, the final movement of that quartet, is in rondo form, and I think it's a lot of fun, real zippy and fun to listen to. We'll also listen to an example of opera, which was a very important genre during the classical period. The vocal form in the classical era that was really popular. We're going to listen to the opening of Act 1 of Mozart's most famous opera, Don Giovanni. And in just a few minutes of that opening, 5-10 minutes max, we're going to see an amazing array of dramatic activities. We're going to see an attempted seduction, a rape. We're going to see a peasant being cheeky to his master. We're going to see some ethical dilemmas, conflicts of loyalty. We're going to see all kinds of presentations of males and females in various ways. I think you'll really enjoy it because really Mozart does a fantastic job of creating actual people, individuals, and not just kind of the iconic characters that we heard, say, in Orfeo, where we really didn't get to know Orpheus as a person, but kind of as a figurehead or someone who stood for certain values. Thank you very much, and happy listening.